special guest is Maurice Glasman. Maurice Glasman is Lord Glasman. He was elevated to the House of Lords 9 years ago. And as I remember, Maurice, one of the reasons given in the letter from the Queen was all the work you did on the living wage.
That's right.
Yeah, which I always felt terribly unfair because Maurice and I worked on that together, and he got to be a lord, and I didn't get very much anything out of it at all. So, yeah. But fair enough.
Such is life, everybody.
Such is life. Maurice was one of the key leaders of the industrial areas of our campaign with citizens in London, getting the living wage. And then went to the House of Lords and started a thing called Blue Labor, which maybe he'll describe in this talk today. And it's been really a leader of critical thinking about what the Labour Party ought to look like and what the country ought to look like. He took a leading role in the Brexit campaign, took a lot of heat for it. Now he turns out he's brilliant about that. But we're really fortunate to have him talk with us today. Maurice understands the IAF really, really well. He really knows us. In fact, he's one of us. So Maurice, I'm just going to turn this over to you.
Okay, thanks. And really, everybody, hi. I hope that you and your families are well. I really hope that you're coping as best you can with just to introduce the frame as one of the less benign aspects of globalization that we're now dealing with. Let's just put it in that way. And that's essentially the theme I want to talk to you about. Really, thanks, Jonathan. He's underestimated. I really owe the IAF and I owe community organizing really changed my life and the way that I think about things. So in the talk today, I'd like to talk, not really about now and how to cope with the pandemic, but what kind of politics is going to come out of this? What are the changes that are going to come out of this? And how can that work in favor of, people having greater democratic power in the places that they live and in the places that they work? That's my overwhelming concern. And I think the things we are going from a supremely unhospitable environment to perhaps a slightly better environment that we can shape and mold. So, yeah, I work with really closely with Jonathan, with Leo as well, and with Arnie Graf came over to England for a couple of years to talk about how to renew and engage with renewing the labour movement here and trying to, re-establish some form of relationality to it. As you can probably guess it, that was not one of our biggest wins. So here we are. I just want to talk about what I mean by globalization. So I see globalization as entirely opposed to internationalism. We should always have international solidarity with workers and with poor people all over the world. But globalization, just roughly speaking, is a system of global finance that essentially makes resistance to capitalism illegal through treaty law. So whether it's NAFTA, whether it's the EU, the unmediated movement of capital, people, money and things mean that essentially it's legal matter. When Jonathan and I started off with the living wage, if you remember, Jonathan, the first response of bosses was, it's illegal, it distorts competition, it limits access to the labour market. Thankfully, we got through that. So I just want to say that globalization is a form of capitalism that wishes to turn human beings and nature into commodities. That's the goal, to derive profit in any way it can from any aspect of life that used to be done by people together. But that's the key thing, is that human beings and nature, they wish to turn those two things into commodities. When I started in Labour and I moved from community organising to more national politics, used to be criticised a lot for working with faith communities. And I always used to reply, well, at least they don't think that the free market created the world. So, that was my response to that, there was something inherited there. Unfortunately, this is a bit of a strange experience because I'm seeing some of you laughing, but I can't hear it. So it's a bit like being in some kind of a bit surrealist. So there's this relentless pressure that you've all experienced, and it's not just that capitalism puts this relentless pressure to dissolve associations, to dissolve unions, to subordinate democracy to a legal framework that's absolutely subordinate to that system of commodification. It also turns the state into some kind of regional administrator, you know, for the enforcement of those treaties. So just to get straight to the point, I found it an inhumane and anti-democratic system, and that's been essentially in place for a long time. But it began to shake, and I think it began to shake in 2008, when a lot of us actually met in 2008, when there was the financial crisis. And through the financial crisis, it wasn't just that there was that all the bosses got away with it. It was also that the burden of that crisis was paid overwhelmingly by poor people, by the working class, that was the way it shook down. And then here in England, that's just to explain, then we had this big shock with Brexit, where the EU, which was seen as a fundamental pillar of international stability and order, was perceived by the working class in our country as an enforcer of this neoliberal globalizing scheme. There was lots of other political matter moving around in it, but they did it. I'm not going to get really involved in America, which I don't understand half as well. But for me, looking at it, what I will say is that there has to be an explanation of why working class people who voted Democrat voted for Trump, some kind of explanation of that shift. And part of that was that the Democrats and Clinton were completely signed up to the globalizing, progressive, liberal order. And people felt that they had no power and they couldn't do anything about it, and were certainly willing to give things a kick. So the first thing about the new order that we're going to emerge into, which, as I say, this coronavirus intensifies and accelerates those pre-existing trends. I'm not expecting you to be interested in what's going on in Europe particularly, and neither should you be. But all I'm saying is that essentially free movement stopped in 4 days. Countries put up their borders, the nation state became the primary focus of government, and within that every national tradition emerged. So Germany, which is quite close to the United States, has had a very strong federal response, with local states playing a very big role. You notice France declared war and then went home. Spain just rolled over any form of Catalonian autonomy and re-established the Castilian state. And as you notice here in England, here in Britain, the state really didn't know what to do. So a kind of, you know, bumbling along with a mixture of empiricism and don't go to the pub. So the nation state and the traditional structures of the nation state, and I follow America very closely, and I noticed that there's been a very important increase in the power of governors. You know, state governors are suddenly much more important figures than they were. City mayors are really a very significant part of it, and the different regions in the country. There's the re-emergence, but what I'm really getting across to you is that politics matters again. And democracy matters again. And I think that that's something that's very important to understand. And for us as community organizers and people working within this tradition, it opens up some space. The second feature that I think will be long lasting, as I say, that has been emerging. I don't know how the language was in America. In England, the working class were called the left behind. They were called the losers of globalization. They were considered a bit like a relic of a previous age that wouldn't quite go away. But now, and increasingly over those 10 years, they turn out that the working class is the decisive force. It's not the dominant force, it's the decisive force in politics. And what we have here at the moment is, you know, the previously despised and the invisible, you know, the shelf stackers, the lorry drivers, the cleaners, setting aside the nurses and the carers and the doctors. In England, they're getting applauded on the street. You know, people are, so this is an incredible thing, that the previously invisible, the previously despised, are suddenly recognized as the absolutely necessary, you know. So bad time to be a graphic artist, bad time to be a creative finance advisor, good time at the moment to be a worker. So class, to put it brutally, is now very important and necessary. And that's kind of the way that I put it in the article, is that workers are now considered a necessary part of our national immune system. You know, that these are the people that keep us safe. These are the people that keep us fed. These are the people that keep us alive, rather than, let's say, university lecturers or TV directors or script writers. Bad time in many ways. So my new definition of the working class, which I'd like you to sort of laugh at, if you will, is something you can't do from home. Okay, so if you have to leave the house and do something for somebody else with your hands, thus putting yourself in danger of your life, you're working class. It's a new definition. It means that doctors, some doctors, are working class. It certainly means that nurses are working class. And it's just to get it that you can't do it from home. And in my country, this is now a massive shift. People are recognizing work and workers as necessary. So that's the second big change. And the third big change is that people are, and it's linked to the other two, is that people are recognizing for the first time in my living memory the importance of place. A lot of people are stranded actually in the places that they live. And I do know that this is as true in America as here. Basically the land outside the big cities was called flyover country, literally God-forsaken. If, you know, God forbid, an academic friend of mine got a job in a provincial town, the word they'd use was God-forsaken. I'll go to this. Suddenly the God-forsaken places are holy places. They're places where people produce food. They're places where people produce the things that we need for the National Health Service. But also there's a real concern for, is it used in America? Say it's a weird thing, all different things bring up cliches. At the moment, people are talking about supply chains, you know, the need to secure supply chains of food. You know, my joke is workers of the world unite, you've got nothing to lose but your supply chains. And people are really engaged with food and housing for the homeless. And suddenly, I mean, I'm overwhelmed in my work by people discovering neighbors that they never knew they had, although they're in a condition of isolation. So people are beginning to link with something that has real meaning now, strangely, which is community. You know, how do we feed each other? How do we shield the vulnerable? Apologies for the absence there, but essentially what I was talking about was the importance of place, the importance of the local institutions, the importance of the food supply, engagement with housing. So essentially what we're going to be moving towards, I think, is a post-globalization politics, a politics that there's far more space for place, where working class are recognized as to be more important than they have been probably for the last half century, and where the political institutions matter more. So, can you hear me? So then a conversation's required about what that means for us, I think. And what it opens up is the very fundamental substance of organising. So Jonathan and I, with Leo, with Arnie, worked on the living wage, but how workers are treated, the dignity of labour, is going to be a central feature. And that can't avoid looking at unions, both local, vocational and locational democracy, the forms of association that will protect the human status of labour. It can't avoid looking at housing, particularly community land trusts, what constitutes healthy settlement. There's a huge amount going on here. I'm assuming it's going on in America too, about rent and about stopping evictions for people not paying their rent. But I think land reform and housing reform, lots of stuff I would imagine in your country about access to medicine and building of genuinely mutual and collective health systems. So listen, I've spoken for about 20 minutes, so I'm completely open, to how you want to take it from here.
Andreas Richter.
Yeah, hello everybody. This is Andreas from Berlin, Germany. I just want to give it a try to test the button, but as I have the chance to say something, Maurice, thank you for this great article. It was fun to read, and there are a lot of thoughts around that also here in Germany and Berlin, and I appreciate this opportunity to broaden my horizon, and really looking forward for the next articles and opportunities to talk about stuff like that. But I have no exact question. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
All right, Reverend Edmonds, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hello, thank you for this opportunity to be part of this. I would like to know what sources can be used to foster the creative impulse that will be needed to reimagine institutions. For example, during the Great Depression in this country, I'm part of Washington, D.C., in the Delta of Mississippi, that's when the blues were created. And so the blues were created out of a crisis moment. It was an endearing thing, So what kind of sources can be used to help create or reimagine our institutions?
Go ahead.
Okay, please.
If you're not speaking, go ahead and mute yourself, please. And
Yeah, I'll take a couple more.
Okay, Pam Brown.
Pam, you're muted.
Hi, Maurice.
Hi.
Absolutely loved everything you said. It was brilliant. I'm interested in how you think people like the people who are delivering groceries, the people who are really important now, how are they going to realize how important they are and organize based on that?
Yeah. Okay. Got it. What's your name again?
Pam Brown.
Brilliant.
She's from your country, Maurice.
I kind of recognize that. I didn't want to be too intimate for that
Yorkshire.
reason.
From Yorkshire.
Brilliant. Where in Yorkshire?
Leeds.
Fantastic.
All right, we've got one from Rob English. Rob, you there?
You have a question?
Sorry, guys. I was trying to unmute. Maurice, really, really good to see you, and really appreciate you laying this out and agitating us to think about the politics. I totally agree that politics will matter, place will matter, local matters, and that's a great opportunity and opening for us as you described. I'm curious, one sentence really stood out to me in your piece where you say capital will be remorseless in recouping its losses. And this is going to be a fight. And I'm curious of what you're thinking, how capital will respond and how we can deal with that threat. This is going to be a fight.
Okay. So I'll begin responding. Once again, apologies for working from my phone. My let's just say the capitalism is failing me a bit in my internet delivery, so I shouldn't really be surprised. I'll deal with those in sort of reverse order. So you know, obviously I'm now, for my sins, involved in more national politics. So one of the things that Blue Labour is putting forward is a moratorium on any foreign ownership for a year after the coronavirus. Because what's going to happen is New York, City of London, Shanghai, they're already making up wish lists of companies that they wish to purchase. So, you know, that's a straightforward political fight, in a sense, a national political fight. But what they're going to do is you know, intensify the demands on labour to be cheaper. They're going to be extracting rents from people. This is going to be, it's going to be a really merciless fight. So where you are, and this relates to my answer to Pat as well, what are the distinctive things that you bring to this? You know, what are the distinctive aspects? And you have existing relationships with local institutions and with people in local institutions. You know, you're going to have to smell out where are the areas of attack. I would imagine it would be on evicting people from their homes, on pushing down wages as soon as this is over. So you're really going to have to be very wise in building local political campaigns around that, and particularly in relation to Pat, we've got to recognise that the actual trade unions are not close to their members. You know, a renewal of that, and in a way reconceptualising it. In America, you've got a tradition of locals. They used to be really important, and I would imagine that locals would have to combine a defense of renters, people who are renting and getting evicted for not paying their rent, people who are struggling to pay their mortgages, and, you know, and work. The two are completely, you know, I began by saying, what is capitalism? It's the commodification of human beings and nature. Part of that is land, part of that is housing. So a reorientation, and to the Reverend who spoke first, you know, creativity is working with the real in new ways. So what are the issues now confronting all different kinds of communities? And what I would say to you is what I'm not seeing in organising here, and I haven't really picked it up from America, is, you know, there's a relationship between farmers and urban people, you know, how to build new relationships with people who live on the land to completely smash this polarization, because what's facing poor people in the country and poor people in the cities is the same, which is the domination of corporate ownership without any effective support for sustaining their communities and way of life from politics. And I would say that you've got a real opportunity here to build unusual and unexpected coalitions of mutual interest. That's, you know, Rob, that's what I would fundamentally say, and I'm completely open to continuing that conversation.
All right, does anyone have any other questions? Yes, Pastor T. I don't know who that is.
Yes. It seems to me that when we emerge from the quarantines and shutdowns, probably for not at least the next couple of months, hopefully, any comment at all, that we need to be proactive and not reactive. Get a lot of feedback. We need to be proactive and not reactive, so that we are prepared to aggressively lay out our agenda, which may include calling almost for a national strike, to tell to let governments know and corporations know the game that you all were playing on us, the okie doke you were running on us prior to the coronavirus, no longer exists. We are very clear who the essential workers are now. And without us, without them, the economy does not function, the nation does not function. And so in order for it to function in the future, these are our demands. And we're gonna have some that are non-negotiable. And, you know, basically people who make a lot of money, they're not used to working real hard. They don't wanna do it themselves. And therefore, I think that will be a pregnant moment for us to really, but again, like the minute the shutdown ends, we need to be in the streets saying, oh, no, you don't. This is a new normal. We're not going back to what we had before. But how do we mobilize that? First of all, how do we wake people up? Because they're just going to be so happy to be able to go, I guess, to Georgia and get a tattoo, or to Florida and go to the beach or whatever. But that, you know, just to get out, to go to church, to go to your cousin's house, my sister-in-law, to go see her new grandson. But right after that, like within a week of that, we need to be on it and in the streets even to press the case, to make it obvious we're not willing to go back to what used to be, because it was never right. It was never fair. And now that housing all of a sudden has become in vogue, living wages are in vogue, hey, it was always necessary. Food deserts were always a problem, etc.
Pastor T, I will take a cluster, but is that a real backdrop that you've got?
I wish. That's where I was in
okay.
The beginning of November, so I just put it up every
now and then. I just imagined that you were ringing in from Hawaii or something.
It was Puerto Rico, but yeah, same
okay.
motif.
Got it. Yeah, next, please.
All right, Leo Penta.
Yeah, thanks, Maurice, for these insights. I just wanted to throw in one thing, though. We are tending, I think, to talk about this as if there's going to be a switch thrown and that everything goes back to the way it was before, so to speak. And I think we have to start now if we're going to be ready for the aftermath. And I think that's where a lot of creativity needs to come in. I'd just like to hear your take on that. Thanks.
Yeah. I'll take one more, if that's possible.
Does anyone have another question? Ed? Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, good morning. Thanks for your talk, Maurice. I'm a retired union laborer, and it seems to me that to go forward in a capitalistic society, we need cooperation of all three parts of that labor equation. We need unions, we need management, and even when I say management, as far up as the mega corporations, and we need the government as well. I think that in this country, unions have been on the wane for a long time. How do we adjust this? How do we drag big business and the government over our way a little bit, so we can have that equality at the negotiating table going forward?
Yeah, well, that's the really big question. So I'll deal with these. They're integrated, but I'll deal with them in order. In response to Pastor T, and this relates to what Leo said, there is an intensity now to just get involved with coping with what's got the lockdown. But if you can think about how you come out of the lockdown and take stock of the relation, what were the limitations on your organizing before? What was stopping things happening? What are the relationships that you need in order to really activate? And Pastor T, you know, build a firm consensus around 4 to 5 key points. You know, housing is certainly one of them, but you need to engage with each other and with your member institutions now on the political agenda that comes out of it and the organizing agenda that emerges. In other words, you can't just make it up. You've got to work with the communities. And this relates to Leo's point completely, is that this is a time of reckoning. You know, if it's going to be a new normal, then there's got to be a renewal of organizing and of local power and of work, and bring them together. So, and this relates to Ed. So Ed, this is kind of quite a big one. What are the reasons for union decline? One of them is an incredibly hostile external environment. Another one is that did unions work within the experience of their members? And did they represent their members? Or were they also part of a globalizing establishment that signed up to the liberal agenda? You know, these are, so to renew unions, to what extent were unions involved in defending renters, small farmers? You know, this is where I think that your organizations come in. Now, what's happened here in a very interesting way, when I say here, I mean in England, in Britain, is that when the government did its bailout packages, they invited the unions in. And they invited the small business organization in, and they invited the bosses organization. So kind of soft corporatism, which would be very familiar to Leo and Tobias in Germany, is creeping here. I haven't noticed the same thing going on in the States. But what's clear is that in the institutions that still exist that represent, there's got to be a common position negotiated between yourselves. This goes back to Pastor T's comment. There's got to be a political agenda here that you can lead, and which will lead to the renewal of local institutions through which you then increase your power by organizing. That's the central message that I'm putting across. So at this moment where there is this huge recognition of the importance of work and workers, and at this time when people are realizing the importance of the place they live, and then the importance of politics, how could it be a better moment for organizing? This is my point. Suddenly you've been countercultural. I can bear witness, we've been countercultural for 30 years. When I talked about place, nobody cared. When I talked about the dignity of work, they spoke to me about technology. Honestly, this has been an endless thing. Suddenly, people are talking about the necessity of labor, the dignity of labor, the importance of community, and the sanctity of place. I've never, ever heard the people that I'm talking about this. I had a Zoom with the Bank of England. That would be, I don't know, the Federal Reserve. And they rang up and said, okay, Maurice, okay, we get it. How do you do this now? How do you secure local food supply chains? How do we actually recognize the key workers as something other? You know, the word fungible means just replaceable. They just viewed labor, if this lot can't do it, we bring in a whole load of people from somewhere else to do it. It doesn't matter. And suddenly it's changed. So you've got to use your political intelligence to work out, Pastor T and all of you, a common agenda that will completely be in tune with the experiences and the sentiments of your people. So Alinsky said, work inside the experience of your people and outside the experience of your enemies. Right now, your enemies are, you know, Ed, they're not really making themselves felt. But as Rob said, as soon as this is over, they're going to come for you. So how do you build the strength of the coalition around work, around place, and around the dignity of the human being, which I take it to be the fundamental aspect, relationality, you know, that we need each other. So in Catholic social thought terms, you know, it's solidarity, it's the status of the worker, and it's subsidiarity in terms of decentralized people. So, you know, that's the work. I'd love to work with you on that, because this time is not going to come again. So I know it feels like a terrible time, but if you get bogged down in service delivery right now, you'll miss this moment of strategic thinking and relationship building. That's the kind of brutal thing I've got to say. I see it all the time here. People are getting locked into, you know, filling in the cracks. But really what you've got to do is flesh out the new space, the space of action, and to build those relationships. And people are open to reach out beyond who you would normally reach out to, which is why I mentioned the farmers, the farmsteads. They're going to be enormously threatened again by corporate land takeover, and they're going to want some power, and they're going to recognize that they need to build coalitions to build that power.
Okay, when I call on you, if you could introduce yourself and your institution, that would be very helpful. Thank you. Susan? Can unmute yourself.
Okay.
Hi, Susan.
I'm here in Bethesda, Maryland. I'm part of AIM. And my question basically is, what do you see education, the role of education and the institution of education looking like going forward? Our schools, but the whole environment of education.
Yeah.
Okay, and Amy Bruno?
I wrote it in the chat as well. I'm Amy Bruno. I'm an organizer with Metro IAF and
Amy, it's
DC.
great to meet you. Obviously,
Hey.
I've heard a lot about you. Yeah.
Hey. I'm thinking a lot about building an agenda that is large enough in scale for the moment and for the appetites that we have internally with our members, but also in the world. And making sure that we're also pragmatic at the same time about what is winnable. But I don't want us to talk ourselves out of a big agenda based on sort of habits of pragmatism, but I still want to win. So I'm curious about your thoughts about that.
All right.
And that's all the questions we have at the moment.
Okay. So, well, first of all, I'm just making notes. In terms of schools, and is that schools are part of the, we call them anchor institutions. They're part of the local civic ecology. They uphold a good that's not an exclusively market good, the well-being of the child and the education of the child. So in as much as the schools are local institutions embedded to their area, they need to be part of a wider coalition. That schools are part of the coalition. So my focus is not so much on the curriculum, and what they learn, what children learn. It's about the school as embedded in a wider, what I call civic ecology, that strengthens the local civic immune system. This is the language that I'm using when I'm talking politically. Now, in terms, Amy, of what you've said, this is just a brief moment. People forgive me for just recapping a bit of recent history. So the whole logic of bringing Arnie and Arnie coming to England was the possibility of building a winning coalition on the primacy of Labour and the primacy of local power. And we came across a very big problem, is that the progressive left, as I call it, and my joke is it's the last thing you want to hear when you go to the doctor, it's progressive, is that they don't want local people to have power. They don't like local people. They don't like working class people. They think that they're xenophobic. They think that they're misogynistic. They think that they're racist. They think that they're very unpleasant. And above all, they don't want their children to go to school with them under any circumstances ever, right? So they tend to monopolize the state-based agenda. But what I'd say to you, Amy, is that if you want to win, and you want to win big, there is no way that you can abandon the working class and the farmers. Just no way on earth. This is my fundamental human. So all efforts have got to be made to build that coalition, and a coalition that speaks in what you completely understand, that speaks to their values and their interests. Family, place, work, community, decency, all of those things. We mustn't be afraid. Now, what happens, and Pam will be my witness in Britain, if you say the words family and you say the words work, a lot of people say you're a conservative. We don't like these words. Even if you say the word democracy, that's a bit, well, what if they make the wrong decision? What do you do then? So it's a very liberal, legalistic, globalized consensus that needs to be smashed. So if you're genuine, Amy, it's lovely to meet you, but if you want to get involved in a conversation about this, I would love it. But that consensus, what I'm saying to you today is that the old order is broken. But if you remember Alinsky's saying, the price of a successful politics is a constructive alternative. That's one of the rules. And to build that constructive alternative, you have to strategically turn whatever you're doing into an object of affection for poor working class people. It mustn't be a force that's opposing them. It's got to be part of it. So this was done with the Wobblies. If you know, way back in your country's history, it was done with the populists, you know, as they used to be called, and they still are called. But the idea that you're going to build a winning coalition essentially among graduates is a kind of weird fantasy that we've been living with, led by graduates, for graduates and their children. You know, a new agenda needs to be formed, and the space needs to be opened to break the Trump coalition. And the Trump coalition will not be broken unless there's affection for who you are and what you stand for. Amy, is this making sense? This is the key political thing. And without the organization of local interests, this cannot be done. But how, like Rob, in Maryland, there's Maryland. You know, it's not just Baltimore. What's the relationship between the food supply and the Baltimore poor? Can relationships be formed at this time that can broker that? That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. And how can we get unions out of their comfort zone and genuinely engage with organizing local people across their divisions around things that are of mutual, not just mutual interest, but are mutual values? I mean, that's a very long story in America, but that's the key story and always will be the key story. Sorry, that was an outburst, but that's where I'm at.
All right, Louise Green.
Hi, Louise.
Hello. Louise Green from Maryland IAF PATH,
Right.
Howard County. I'm curious, in this power of place that you articulate, how this relates and deepens when you think about global sustainability, agriculture, worker connection to land, renewable energy, and then the kinds of environmental degradation that have disproportionately hit people of color, both in urban areas and rural areas. And yesterday I was in a global economic forum with speakers from Africa and other places, thinking very clearly about this new opportunity and new economy with a different relationship to all of that. So I'm just curious your thoughts.
Yeah. Is there anybody else who wants to ask a question? Just asking.
Matt McDermott.
Maurice, Matt McDermott, I'm IAF organizer in Connecticut, and I guess I'm wondering a little bit more on your thoughts about just the nationalism that we've been seeing around the world and that Trump certainly represents. And even I think now we're seeing sort of sub-nationalisms of regions of states in the US gathering together to align themselves against him or with him in some respects, and how you see that as a threat and an opportunity at the same time.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, this is by nature perfunctory. I say to everybody who's asked a question, I'm completely open to a continual engagement, which I'm sure we can work out outside of this. So first of all, just to reply to Louise, but it's also all the time, Matt, I'm addressing you with this. So one of the things about globalization is that it was magic. You didn't need a secure food supply. You didn't need to produce medicines. You didn't need to produce low value things like rubber gloves and masks. This was all to be globalized. This was all to be essentially put out to China. That's a whole other area if you want to talk about China and the way that I think things are going in relation to that. So essentially you had a global system based on the maximum possible exploitation of natural resources, nature, in developing countries, and the maximal exploitation of people in developing countries, often without any unionization or any ability to unionize. So one of the things, Pam, that Blue Labour's putting out is that any trade deal that we sign as a country has to have, as a condition, free and democratic trade unions in the country that we're trading with, right? That's a condition going forward. But what we've got is maximal domination of capital in relation to the human and the natural element. And essentially the way I see it is that the global institutions have been working within that. So the key thing is all over so it's just to fill you in. So I make a huge distinction between globalization and internationalism. And internationalism means that a local, so these are the words that they use and that we must keep: sustainable and resilient. You know, there have to be a sustainable, but what do they mean by that? They essentially mean that you give children drugs to stop them being depressed and everybody carries. What it means is that there are diverse and local food supply, and that there are forms of national industry that can supply and sustain the needs of their population under these conditions. And what we need to do, this is way out of organizing, but relates to Amy's point about a big dash, is that form of internationalism we need to develop in terms of the conditionality of our trading. And this relates to Matt's point. So just to say that the alternative to nationalism and the alternative to patriotism, I'm not suggesting that there's big distinctions to be made, is just globalization. So we have to look at solidarity, what we would call solidarity, and how to build broad-based coalitions within the country that we're in order that sovereign nations can act in the interests of their people. This is the vital aspect. So what we've seen, I mean, we had the EU, but you've got NAFTA, and you've got other trade deals that are just supremely favorable to capital. That's how they function. And so this is part of the new era, Matt. How do we strengthen a national democratic politics? And then this relates to Amy's point. Then the responsibility is to build these new coalitions that can resist just the domination of the educated and the rich of every aspect of national life. Because the alternative to that is that we leave the field open to authoritarian and racist forms of nationalism. So the choice is not between nationalism and not nationalism. The choice is between an effective democratic politics that represents workers and farmers and the dispossessed, that redistributes assets. Now, with your concept that you did with Nehemiah Holmes, you've got a model. And Rob, in Baltimore, you did it. You've got a model of house building that redistributes assets to people. With the living wage campaign, you've got a politics that actually resisted globalization through building citywide coalitions. So Matt, then the issue is, how do you build coalitions across the country that can challenge the two? So essentially what you've got now is a national coalition essentially that serves the rich. This is how I see it in America, and that would be Trump, and a kind of globalized vision of what America should be that I associate with Clinton. The new era demands that workers play a much more significant role, and place plays a much more important role within a nation state framework. So to summarize, Matt, which is a huge, huge issue, there's no safe place anymore. There's no guarantee against any of this stuff. There's just politics and democratic coalitions that can shape it in the way that we want. in other words, we don't have a vaccine. We don't have a vaccine for the pandemic, and we don't have a vaccine against horrible politics. That's how I view it.
All right, can we take 2 more questions maybe?
Please.
Okay, first I'm gonna go with Elisa.
Oh.
Unmute yourself, there you go.
Yeah, just
Notice everybody the name. This is a family reunion. Yeah.
hi cuz, how are you?
Ah, could be better.
When is your side of the family going to learn that it's 2 S's, not 1?
Let's not get involved in that in public.
Okay. I was wondering, so first of all, the conversation about place is really important to me. And in Hebrew, my favorite name for God is Makom, which means place, right? And so what does it mean to be displaced? What does it mean to be placed? But that is one of God's holy names. So one of our strengths in the IAF is that we are very local and we're rooted to place. But I'm wondering about the tension in this moment, that if we are to act large, how do we act on a few things? If we're all doing our own thing in all of our different places, then how do we begin to have a unified message to act large around a few things? And so what's that tension, and how do you think about that tension between the very local and the acting together in coalition, even amongst ourselves in the IAF, to do something large?
Yeah, well, okay. So I will respond to that in a second. Is there a second question?
We have one last question from Pastor T again, a follow-up question.
Right.
Maurice, you talked a lot about labor, and you did mention in passing, but it was very significant, wondering if labor leadership is actually in touch with the representative of the concerns of the quote unquote average worker.
Yeah.
Essentially what we're talking about is nothing less than a revolution, both politically, in terms of labor and everything else. How can we go around entrenched labor leaders who are very cozy with management and corporate interests to get actually to workers and inspire them to come out of their lethargy? I don't know, maybe they have been awakened as a result of the virus, who knows, and stand up for themselves. Because I almost feel as if labor leadership might stand in the way, stand in between the movement that needs to happen and the workers. And without the workers, as you said earlier, we don't really have much.
Yeah. Okay. So it's going to be very sad for me to say goodbye to you. So I'm letting you know that I'm going to tune in next week when Leo's speaking, and Leo's going to be speaking about Carl Polanyi. This is relating to Elisa's question and to Pastor T's question, and Polanyi is interesting because what he sees, I got my analysis of capitalism from him, that what he sees is that it's really straightforward what happens. You know, the human being is turned into a commodity. Then land is turned into a commodity, and land means 2 things, food and housing, right? And then they turn money into a commodity when it was produced by the state. So the way I've always approached organizing is to keep that in mind. So it's no surprise to me that when you organize, what did you organize around? You organized around labor with the living wage. You organized around housing, with Nehemiah Homes and other community land trusts to protect them from being commodified. You know, everybody needs a home. Everybody needs to earn enough to live and feed their family. And I've extended that out. Jonathan is very well aware, with really pushing Pam for regional banks, for the endowment of local banks, so that local people can have access both as an alternative to usurious payday lenders, which is where money really eats into the souls of the poor, but also in terms of allowing people some autonomy to borrow and to start their own businesses and to do things like that. So on the subject of Makom, Alisa, and of place, I think it's always going to be the case that we're going to organize around labor, land, and money, you know, and preserving those things as having a sacred or a human or a local aspect. So, but then it gets to the tricky one, which Pastor T has raised, is that you're going to have to seriously build a coalition among yourselves around those issues that are central when this ends, and to build, you know, relationships between each other on matters of common concerns. But what Pastor T says, you've got a Labour leadership here and in America that is completely committed to the old order, right? They see what's going on as a flipping menace, as a total menace. They see nationalism rampant. They see populism rampant. You know, if you talk, I've had this just to share with you in my political life, you talk about the dignity of labor and people being treated with dignity, and people think that you're hostile to modernity, that this is an archaic and wrong and bad language, and it's horrible. Everything that they're saying. So between yourselves, you've got to really find the mental space to conceive of how this could be good, how this, and to build the necessary coalitions to make it happen. So Pastor T, in a brutal sense, this is the problem, is that the challenge to the prevailing union leadership, like I couldn't help but notice that, and I'm not going to get involved with this, but the whole Bernie Sanders thing disappeared in an hour in South Carolina. The whole thing just went, and it was gone. And a guy who looks like he's got dementia won 5 states that he didn't even organize it. You know, like it was gone. And so what's happened is, the logic is that we've got to abandon the language of progressivism. I kind of alluded this to Amy, but it's even more demanding. If you challenge the union leadership from a progressive left perspective, you're not going to connect with the people you need to connect. So the language of organizing is very well equipped for this. Work within the experience of your people and outside the experience of your enemies. Family, place, and work. You know, these are the fundamental things around which we organize, and then our democratic way of life. And our faith traditions, thank God, are rich with the dignity of labor that the last will be. So we don't need to take them on from a progressive left perspective, but you need to build a common good between conservative and radical concerns. That those two must go together. This is really hard, I know, but I'm just sharing from my soul what I've learned over these years, so that you can build support among membership that doesn't break into a left-right division or moderate or extremist division, but between eras, that this is the unionism of the new era. Pastor T, I hope that makes some sense, but that's the key. That's the key.
It makes sense. It's heavy lifting for sure.
Yeah. So okay. So another truth. Unfortunately, there's no. Although we aren't working class because we're working from home, everybody. Yeah, this is really, really, really hard work, both internally and externally. But I just share with you, it's great work, and you meet the unexpected surprise of meeting people who get it along the road is a blessing that I can't really describe. But we've also got to fight the prejudices in ourselves about doing this, about placing ourselves in a particular politics that is very limited and very urban. So one of my concerns is, you know, the Industrial Areas Foundation, when industry was smashed, it became the Urban Areas Foundation, and the urban areas are overwhelmingly graduate, you know, and then with dispossessed and completely smashed African American communities. And so to build outside the urban is a really important part of this. I hope that, I just really hope that makes some sense and is helpful.
I'm gonna thank you, Maurice, for taking time with us. Thank you for the writing. Big thumbs up, everybody, for me. But this was really great.
Listen, I'm not gone. I'm going to be on next week's panel as well. So you know.
Yes, you are. So what we're thinking, everybody, is that we would take Thursdays at noon, read a piece together, like we read Maurice's piece this time, and then spend an hour or a little bit more talking about it, thinking about it, and especially thinking about how it affects the organizing that we're going to want to do now during this pandemic and immediately after the rules start changing a little bit and we can do more of what we're familiar with, which is being out in the community, doing face-to-face organizing. You know, Maurice told me the other day, we've been talking weekly for a while. Maurice told me the other day that as the result of the work, and I saw Deborah on here too, Deborah Littman. Hello, Deborah.
Deborah.
Yeah.
Where's Deborah?
She's right there.
Hey, Deborah. Please be in touch. Great to see your face. Great.
Deborah's working for the ATU in Canada now, but the work that Deborah, myself, Maurice, and a lot of other people did resulted in a living wage campaign in England that was in many ways much stronger than the one that ever happened here. And Maurice reported the other day that the minimum wage in the UK, what were you telling me, is the highest?
Yeah, highest in Europe.
It's the highest in Europe. And it was a direct reaction to the work we did. It had a big effect on the livelihoods of the poorest of the poor in the working class in the United Kingdom. Look, we are the urban, the IAF is the UIF, your Urban Areas Foundation, but that doesn't mean we can't start talking to people who we typically haven't talked to. And that doesn't mean we can't be a little bit more like the Wobblies thought the left should be, you know, where the small business people were part of it and part of the working scene as part of the working class. And I think the moment we get out of here, we need to talk to different people. What I'm learning during this period of time is that you can maintain relationships this way actually pretty well. It's hard to build new ones. It's almost impossible to build new ones. But we're not going to be cloistered in our houses forever. So what we'd like to propose is the next 2 Thursdays, we've thought about the agenda for those. And if people have ideas for the ones after that, we're really interested in knowing what those would be. But next week, Leo Penta, who leads our work in Germany, and I'm going to introduce him here in a second to everybody, was an organizer here in America and a priest in the EBC when I first met him 35 years ago, and now has built a huge organization in Germany. Some of the organizers are online with us. He's going to lead a discussion. I'm going to let him describe the reading, how to get a hold of the reading, and hopefully a number of you are going to want to come back for that discussion. I know Maurice is going to be back next week to kind of pick up where we left off a little bit on this discussion. So Leo, why don't you describe what you're going to do next week? You're muted, Leo.
Unmute.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Maurice. When I was talking to Maurice yesterday, when we were planning this for next time, he was almost certain that I was going to propose something from Hannah Arendt. And when I didn't, he was very happy that I'm proposing Karl Polanyi and his book, The Great Transformation, which was written at another kind of key juncture in history in 1944, just as the war was beginning to come to a close. And the reason I picked it is because it picks up from what Maurice said at the beginning, one of the first sentences of his piece, and what he talked about today, the notion of commodification and how central that is to not only globalization, but the idea of capitalism. And so I'd like to drill down on that using Polanyi's book. I would suggest to read especially the 6th chapter, because it expounds even more on what Maurice was talking about today in terms of land, labor, and capital, actually as fictitious commodities, that they were turned into commodities, and in doing so, they were taken out of, you will, the bed of the normal lives of people in place. And the whole struggle or reaction after that is about how you re-embed these things, how we, in a certain sense, decommodify significant portions of our lives and people's lives. So that's why the proposal to read Karl Polanyi next week, at least chapter 6. You can get this as an ebook on Amazon. If you get the edition, the Beacon Press edition, there's also a very good foreword by Joseph Stiglitz, who takes this into the time, it was written around the time of the financial collapse in 2008, so, or just after that. So it's also very instructive as to how he reads this in terms of the crisis of that time. So that's my suggestion for next week, and I'm glad to hear, or would like to hear, any reactions to that via email or however you want to communicate with me. I'm also on Slack.
So that's the new transformation?
The great transformation.
And how's Polanyi's name spelled, please?
P-O-L-A-N-Y-I. And Julie,
I just put the link in to order the
around.
book just in the chat.
Wonderful.
And of course, you're most happy, or most welcome rather, to read more than just chapter 6. But the middle section of the book, where he also historically describes how some of these transformations took place in England and how reactions to them took place in England, and also the connection to industrialization. Just even to grasp the fact that capitalism and the market system is a relatively recent phenomenon in history.
Yeah.
And we haven't had this for as long as there is humankind. And in fact, for only a very short portion of human history, has this been the form of provisioning society, so to speak. And even to realize that, and I think this is all in part about the demythologizing of so much of what we take for granted and assume. And just as the COVID crisis is making certain people visible, I think it also makes certain assumptions more visible. And I think part of our job can be uncovering some of these assumptions. I think I wrote in the chat, really having a vision that kind of debunks a lot of the things that a lot of people assume, and in the good sense, demythologizing them with a counter myth, if you will.
All right, so that's for the next Thursday at noon.
Can I just say one? Well, obviously, being a politician and an ex-academic, 2 more things. The first is I've put my email on the chat. So if anybody's got anything they'd like to talk about or develop or questions, please use that. That's the first. And I think that this route with Polanyi is a fantastic one, Amy, for the big agenda. This is how we can link the local with a different kind of populism, to use the word that has to be done, and unless it's just going to be endless attrition, So just to say thank you to all of you as well, to Jonathan and to Leo and to Julie. I've really enjoyed this, so thanks very much indeed.
Thank you. One more announcement. In 2 weeks, we're going to go back to our founder, and we're going to read chapter 6, I believe it's chapter 6, which is the chapter, because there was so much discussion about unions and about labor in this discussion, we're going to read chapter 6 of Alinsky's, probably his best work, which was Alinsky's biography of John L. Lewis. And he writes a chapter in his book. We used to hand it out at national training, but he writes a chapter in his book on the Flint sit-down strikes in the 1930s and how fundamental they were in the creation of the modern American labor movement. And so we're going to read that, and Ben Gordon, God willing, will be our moderator and just lead the discussion on that one. So we got Polani for next Thursday, and then Alinsky on Lewis for the Thursday after that, and then we'll figure out where we take this. But I want to thank everybody for taking an hour out of their day. Yes,
Jonathan.
Yeah.
Very quickly, I know we are expanding our minds and deepening our thinking for when this is over, but I'm hoping maybe we can think about this week and suggest some solutions next Thursday. There are farmers who are plowing over their crops because the delivery systems, but there are people going hungry. It seems to me that if we can find a way as IAF and allies to step in to that void and say, don't plow over another thing, we figure out whatever means we need, maybe some of this government stimulus money to help pay for the trucking to get the food to places that need it, which is all over the doggone country, rather than just plowing it over. That's offensive that people are hungry and you're plowing over your crop.
That's terrible.
It's a sin, is what it is.
Yes.
And, to use your term, Pastor, it's a sin.
Our term.
Our term too. Well, let's think about that, and let's think about that. Let's start, Pastor T, by thinking about that locally here in Anne Arundel County, because we're very close to the Eastern Shore where a lot of this is going on.
Right.
Well, I want to thank everybody, and you're all invited next Thursday. And let's talk about inviting other people for just 1 second. The answer is yes, you can invite other people, but they should be people who are willing to do the reading and do the thinking. If they want to do the reading and do the thinking and talk about it, then they're welcome. I would prefer, at least at first, that they have some connection to one of our organizations, but we can broaden it beyond that as well. We have an extended family. Deborah is in the ATU in Toronto, but she's one of us. There's other people like Deborah in the room. They're our family. They're our people, and we want to invite them too. Lena Jamul was invited to be on this with some of her people. She was part of the Living Wage campaign in England, and she now leads a union in Minnesota. She's one of us. So we shouldn't have too narrow a definition of who's in, but we should invite people who would like to do the reading and do the thinking with us. All right, thanks everybody.
Jonathan, this is Rob. Thanks to you and Leo for organizing this session, and Maurice, really, really good for us all to be with you. Thank you very much.
Oh,
yeah.
Thank
all
you.
right, so
Thank
Maurice,
you,
I'll never say, now I understand why they made you a lord. This was all a good decision. Very good. The Queen was right. Elevates you to a lord.
She always is. Yeah.
See you later.
See you
Bye-bye,
later.
everybody.
Bye-bye.